I was going to introduce Barry for about 5 minutes. My wife vetted what I was going to say and said, that's good time. Anything more than that, and they're going to want to move on with you. So I'm really excited to have Barry here. I sent out an advertisement with his CV and the latest paper that he's been working on with Gary Cox and Doug North. It's called The Violence Trap. Some of those topics in that paper he's going to be discussing both today and during the Stice lecture on Friday. I really hope you guys can come. And I really hope everyone had a chance to look at the CV and the paper, because there's no way I can do justice to Barry's work in a short introduction. He's going to talk a bit about the biographical details and behind-the-scenes stories that went into the research that is on that CV and that culminated in that working paper that he'll chat about today a bit. And he shared the slides with me, and they're terrific. I'm excited for you guys to be exposed to all the incredible people and places that influenced him and how he's generated a lot of his ideas. I'm gratified because UW has had some role in the process, in his intellectual development and in helping to generate his body of work. One thing that you're probably all aware of is his frequent collaborations with Doug North. He was here 33 years. A lot of the work that Doug did to earn him a Nobel Prize in 1993 was done here at University of Washington. He moved on to Washington University in St. Louis, but during that time, Barry had collaborated with him or shortly thereafter, and they have a lot of connections. And that's very gratifying, I think. Another thing is his collaboration with Margaret, and that book that they co-authored with Bob Bates and Abner Greif, John Laurent Rosenthal. Many of you have read it or heard me preach about it or heard Margaret talk about the production, and that's Analytic Narratives. And that book, I think, embodies Barry's approach to his work and his research and a lot of the best practices that I've espoused and other faculty members have discussed in classes and the like. What did they do in that book? He, Margaret, Bob Bates, Abner, they provide a method for using case studies and small n comparisons to elaborate, operationalize, and test rational choice models. And these models aim to address big problems with important policy implications. And indeed, that's what Barry's been doing his entire career. It's quite remarkable how there's a track record of him brilliantly tackling what I consider, and most everyone else would agree, are the most important puzzles in political economy. Here are some of them. Definitely, I'm not doing justice to the whole corpus of important problems that Barry's tackled, but at least the ones that are more proximate in time involve, this is a classic one actually named after him, how are governments strong enough to protect property rights and civil liberties, also able to make commitments to refrain from transgressing against these limits to their authority? That's a big one, obviously, synonymous with his work. Why do democracy, the rule of law, and development tend to cluster together empirically? And how do countries transition from a state where they are wholly absent to one in which they might become self-enforcing and persist over time? A big one that really motivates his recent paper with Gary Cox and Doug North, The Violence Trap. Why are so many countries still underdeveloped and so many people still impoverished if we know or we possess sound knowledge about what institutions and policies promote prosperity? So there's this big paradox about we have the knowledge, but yet it's not always implemented. Why is that? There's a very innovative answer in the Violence Trap paper that Barry will talk about today and again on Friday. And it's already provoked considerable debate. And hopefully maybe we'll be able to engage in some of that debate today if we have enough time during Q&A. Let me end the introduction by speaking a little bit about the attributes that characterize Barry's work, and the red thread that I've seen, at least, throughout everything he's done. He begins from first principles and proceeds in a very rigorous and parsimonious manner, but it seduces you with its simplicity. It's like so approachable that you kind of are like, well, I could do this, and then you can't. So that's what's great. But at least you try and you feel okay about yourself during the process if you're delusional, right? He draws out his premises to their logical conclusion in a very elegant way that for me, it should be emulated, I believe. He's extremely adventurous, however. He's been unafraid to explore new things throughout his career. And I think he's going to speak a bit about that intellectual adventure that he's had since day one. In American politics alone, he's added considerable knowledge about legislative, presidential, judicial, and bureaucratic politics. So a lot of people would call it a day and a career and say, I've done my part. But he went on, and he has a knack for reinventing himself, and has looked at topics as varied as the role of the rule of law and democratization, comparative constitutionalism, federalism, cooperation under anarchy, civil conflict, oligarchy and crony capitalism, and political culture. He's focused on different countries such as England, Mexico, and China, looked at different time periods like the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and in his most recent book with North and Wallace, all of recorded human history. And he says it himself, so I'm not attributing this to him. That's the subtitle of the book. He's not only very prolific, but his work is extremely influential. His dozens and dozens of articles have covered all of the topics I outlined above and then some. They've been published in the top journals in political science, economics, and political economy. They've won numerous awards. They've been cited copiously across disciplines. And they've often been reprinted and translated into numerous languages. It's not an understatement to say that Barry has helped set the agenda of modern political economy. For that, I and everyone owes him a great debt. I'm extremely honored to have him and excited to hear what he has to say about his Odyssey.
Thank you, Victor. I'm really not sure I can live up to that. And in fact, I find this whole idea of talking about my career unbelievably self-indulgent. But here goes. Let me begin with a story. A story. So my sister's 2 years younger than me. And in high school, I was very friendly with many of her friends. I dated some of them. And when it came to one of her recent reunions, I went to some of the festivities, and she was people were asking about me. She would tell them something. And one woman said to her, "Boy, your brother's a genius." And my sister says to him, "You know, I do have a brother who's a genius, just not that one." So I thought I'd begin that way. So here's an outline. I want to make 7 points, or 7 clusters of points, having to do with the different pieces of my career, starting at Caltech, my first job at Washington University, and then moving to Stanford. And we'll talk about each one of these to some degree. All right, so Caltech. So Caltech was a remarkable place. It was a place dedicated to political economy, integrating politics and economics in the 70s. This was before that was fashionable. In fact, nobody knew whether or not their students would have a job, would be able to get jobs. I was the first PhD of the program, as it turns out. There's a real element of happenstance in this, and that is I had an undergraduate teacher. I was an undergraduate at University of California at Santa Cruz. And I had an undergraduate teacher, Don Whitman, who I've since written with. I walked by him. I wasn't going to go to graduate school. I was going to go work for, I have a rich uncle who thought I should start earning some money, and so I was going to go work for him. But I had an interest in economics and mathematics, but I didn't want to go to graduate school in either of those. And just before spring break, I came across Don Whitman in a plaza, and I said hello. He said hello back, but he was engaged with somebody. So I walked on a few feet, and then I decided, you know, I should say hello to him. I hadn't seen him for a while, so when we eventually talked, he mentioned that there was this new program at Caltech. He knew I lived in Los Angeles and would be visiting my parents. And he said, "Why don't you go talk to him?" So I'd never heard of these, but it sounded interesting. They were interdisciplinary, which is what attracted my attention. And so I went. They were desperate for students. They said they knew the chairman of the economics department, Dan Suits, and who I'd taken a couple courses with. And at Caltech, they were, as I said, desperate. They said, if he says you're okay, you're in. He said I was okay, and I was in. And of course, this is a lot like being in the right place in the right time. And one of the exciting things about it is the unbelievable faculty that was there. So when I arrived, Mo Fiorina, John Fairjohn, and Bob Bates were all there, and they were all assistant professors. So they were all relative unknowns at that time, obviously making something of a name for themselves. And then, of course, there was a senior economist, Roger Knoll, who, those of you that know him know that he's just unbelievable at almost anything he does. And this was just an unbelievable, great group, for fostering people in this area. And I learned a lot from them. And at the time, the way the program was structured, it was largely an economics program with some political science. And the economics was sort of a non-standard mix. You didn't do a year of trade, international trade or macro or industrial organization. It was organized in a much different way that actually made it easier to become, to write on the frontiers. It was organized around themes. But the part about American politics in my first 2 years just really bugged me. Because here I was, a budding young economist, really into that kind of thing. And political science in the early 70s was all written in the language of political sociology. So those of you who have any knowledge of Don Matthews, for example, he's emblematic of that.
Here.
Yeah.
He was here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I mentioned one of the greats of that generation. And it didn't make any sense to me. And I can remember talking to them, why are you making me do this? This is just a waste of time. And I must have been a pain in the ass at some point, and I would say, this is just bullshit. And I remember at one point having a conversation with Bob Bates that just turned my life around professionally. And he said, with what I now recognize as this mix of cajolery and flattery, he said, well, you're a budding young game theorist. Just think about translating. It's just a language. So when you read stuff, when it says stuff about norms, think equilibrium. And when you see this stuff about role, well, think strategy choice. And expectations, well, you know about expectations. He said, go back and reread it. And he was right. It all made sense. And I was then able to get a lot out of that literature. And one of my first papers was generated shortly thereafter called Rational Choice Perspective on Congressional Norms, ultimately published in the American Journal of Political Science. I should say also, my first year, I was sufficiently troubled by this, as well as the fact that I was the only incoming student, so there was nobody to share this experience with, that I almost flunked out. But thank goodness that the program was small, and they, again, were desperate for students. They gave me another chance, and I did manage to finish. Along the way, I would have to say the biggest influence on me was Roger. And so my early work was really began as a specialist in industrial organization and economics. And one of the big parts of industrial organization was this literature on economic regulation. And there was a huge empirical component of it, which was called the economic effects of regulation. And as I was reading this, I began to realize this is the biggest data set that we have. Remember, this is 1974. This is the biggest data set we have on the effects of political decision-making that there exists. Because these guys were out there documenting what actually happened, law by law by law. And nobody had taken advantage of that. And so that sort of began my early work in the bureaucracy and regulation as I began to study the ways in which the political system actually influenced the economic choices. It took me a number of years to figure out how to say it in a way that people would understand. In part because the ideas were new, and in part because I just wasn't very skilled at writing. One of the things I should say, well, I think it's on the next slide. Yes. So, Washington University. So I took my first job at Washington University. I applied to a large number of jobs in political science and economics. I got, 15 interviews in economics and not a single one in political science. I think that reflects the nature of political science at the time. Again, largely in American politics, in political sociology, and rational choice was seen as something as a relatively extreme and outlying. And at most, that was in the era when Bill Riker, who designed and was the great leader of the positive theory program at the University of Rochester, who produced so many of the great students in political science of that generation. He thought of it as planting flags. At most, he could get one of his students at one place, and not the top 10 places. So Carnegie Mellon, Washington University, Michigan State were some of the early places. And I ended up in the economics department. I was happy about that. And one of the funny things about it is it was then on an annual review for assistant professors. So most assistant professors now are reviewed in their third or fourth year, and once in their assistant professor career, unless something goes wrong. Well, at WashU, for some reason, it was one review every year. And so I arrive, and the first thing the chairman does is say, I realize this is kind of odd, since we obviously just reviewed your work to hire you, but nonetheless the university requires it, and we'd like you to assemble your package of materials of what you've done. So I did, and about a month later, or 2 months later, I get a letter from them that seemed highly innocuous. I didn't know what it meant. It just said, do more good work, kind of thing. And the chairman sort of pulls me aside and said, let's go to lunch. I want to read you between the lines. And I should actually go see if I still have this letter, because I'd like to see if he really had to read between the lines, or I was just so naive I couldn't see it in what he said. But what he said is, you're not doing what we think of as economics. And it is kind of, we know we hired you, but we don't know if what you're doing is economics, and we don't know if you have a future here. And so I wrote them off immediately, being wholly, wholly oblivious to the risks I was taking as far as the possible future as an economist. But I just figured there must be an audience for this, and I kept doing it. It turned out there was an upside, but not for a while. And so one of the things I did is I wrote, so I was part of the Center for American Business, Study for American Business, CSAB there, and you can see here I have this little piece of paper, and it says faith. So I wrote that shortly thereafter. So this is the fall of 1977 on a little piece of paper. It's still up on my office wall. And in this larger picture of me, I don't know if you can see this. I'm sorry I don't have a laser pointer, but here I am. I bought this unbelievably huge house. It had a ballroom for $35,000. It was 2,000 square feet on a floor. It was just immense. We couldn't heat it. That's why you can see I'm wearing this unbelievable bathrobe. This is before we started to renovate, so the paneling is there so the wall doesn't fall down. But I don't know if you can see, right there is this sheet of paper stuck up on my wall. So at the same time, I was being productive. I was writing. I got several papers out, and my first 6 papers were all rejected. And I now realize that they were rejected because I was really bad at writing, And I've come to think, as those of you that may have seen or heard of my Caltech rules, of thinking about how important is the distinction between what your ideas, on the one hand, and the vehicle for your ideas. That is, what the paper looks like and how you build an argument. And that's something that I really didn't have a good understanding of at first. So I think my first 6 papers were rejected largely because they were written really poorly. When I give lectures on writing to my students, I bring along some of the phrases that I've saved from some of those early rejections about papers being near but not on the frontier of knowledge. This paper is so far below professional standards that it can't be published in this journal, those kind of things. Yes, we all laugh. Yes, this is your life, right? My students get a good laugh out of it. But I did figure something out about that, in part because of having been at Caltech. I absorbed a lot of rules and ways of thinking about it, and it just took a while to figure it out. I should say my next 12 papers were all accepted. So I met some really interesting people while I was there. So the first of note is Shepsley. And you can see there's a picture of me and Ken at some APSA meeting around 1986 or 87. And Ken and I started in a really interesting way on working on Congress, various things on papers on Congress. And part of the interesting thing about the 80s is that the modelers were very interested in paralleling what the people who studied Congress, like Don Matthews or Dick Fenno, that generation, with the idea being that those guys knew what was going on. And so that if you wanted to model what legislatures did, and in particular what Congress did, you wanted to see what they said legislators did. And the idea was to say, well, okay, well, why is that pattern of behavior they see in equilibrium? And often the people in the literature had really strong intuitions about why that was true, and they even told you about why that was. And so we set about attempting to model that, and I think we had some fair success in that. The next generation was really interesting, people like Crable, because Crable come along in the early 90s, and Crable says, I don't like your models, you're just doing this all wrong. And he was much less interested in what the congressional people had to say. And so since then there's been a much bigger distance between the modeling community, I think, and the congressional community. I continue to work on regulation. One of my, I think it's on the next slide maybe. I worked on several papers involving regulation. So one was the Federal Trade Commission in 1983, published in the Journal for Political Economy. So I had this idea about how Congress affected regulation. And I wrote a paper in 1981 called Regulation, Re-Regulation, and Deregulation that was published in the Duke Law Review. And this was, or rather, Law and Contemporary Problems, which is one of their law reviews. And it was a conference of all economists in industrial organization. And the reaction to this paper was, this is really interesting, but we don't see how it has anything to do with what we work on. And I, of course, was trying to connect the patterns that they were seeing with the congressional politics. And it was 3 different case studies, and it obviously didn't go over well. And it was a big conference. It was 3 days, and I was on the first day. So I had a chance to talk to people about, well, what did I do wrong? Why didn't I convince you? And this guy, one of the senior people in the field, Joe Peck, who was then at Yale, said, well, what about the Federal Trade Commission, you know? That was one of these, he gave the then standard story, was a runaway uncontrollable agency that Congress finally reined back in. How does that square? And I said, oh, that's not what happened. What happened was that Congress, the Federal Trade Commission all along was doing what Congress wanted. It's just the nature of the committee changed really quickly in 1980, and the new people didn't like what the old people fostered. And he says, you get me evidence on that and I'll believe it. And so instead of writing a long, discursive, multi-case paper, I wrote a much more focused paper on the FTC with this story in mind that was at once a case study and also had some systematic empirical work showing that as the relevant congressional subcommittees went back and forth, so too did the mix of caseloads in terms of the cases that the old guys versus the new guys supported. And so the economists really liked that. And one of the things that I learned giving this in George Stigler's workshop at the University of Chicago, one of the toughest places to give a paper for regulation at the time, was Sam Peltzman saying, you know, I'm still not sure I believe it, but look at those T statistics. You know, and it never occurred to me that until that moment that econometrics was rhetoric. Part of how we argue, part of how we make an argument to persuade. And so that was part of I think the paper in the Law and Contemporary Problems was sort of the pivot point where I sort of switched from one way of writing papers to another way of writing papers in a way that I think made more sense. Another great thing, as Victor mentioned about WashU, was that we hired in 1983 Doug North, who left here after, I guess, 33 years, he said. He'd been here a long time. He and I and Gary Cox and a 4th person, maybe Randy Calvert, I'm not sure who the 4th person was, started meeting for lunch and discussing issues, and I don't even know how we decided where we'd start, but we started in English history. And Doug picked a few things for us to read, and we began talking about English history, and at some point we're reading something about the Glorious Revolution, about seemingly property rights are more secure because of Parliament, and I said something like, I bet you capital markets take off right then. And Doug says, no, it's not his memory. He thought that didn't happen at all. he said, but he'd go check. And so he went and he checked with some of his sources of people he trusted, and came back very excited the next day because, in fact, capital markets had made this really big change at that moment. And so that's the genesis of my paper with him on constitutions and commitment, the way in which the nature of the political institutions were reorganized at the Glorious Revolution that allowed much greater commitment on the part of than the government, or previously the king, to honor its commitments. And as a consequence, London, being a rich place, had been greatly withholding all its money from the government because the government wasn't, or the king wasn't trustworthy. Then in leaps and bounds began to give all this money to the government. The final person who was really important for me was Bill Marshall, sort of an unsung hero, in part because he was, one day he left. It's now really common for economists to work on Wall Street, particularly finance economists. But he and his partner in the business school at WashU were the first, and they were asked by Goldman Sachs to come assemble in 1985, the first group of economists to be in a major banking house like that. And so one day he just disappeared. Not literally, I see him with some regularity, but disappeared from the academic life. Nonetheless, he was very important for me because we spent a lot of time learning. It's on the next page, I think. Oh, how do I go back? There we go. So this was the connection between industrial organization, the theory of the firm, and ultimately political institutions. And so one of the questions I began hearing, not in graduate school, but once I got to Washington University, was what is a firm? And when I first heard people ask this, I thought, what a ridiculous question, right? Trained as a neoclassical economist, I thought, well, we all know what a firm is. It's a production function. But that, of course, as you know, that perspective takes for granted the division of authority of a firm and between firms, and takes what things are traded across a market and what things are traded within a firm as given. Whereas the whole question in the theory of the firm is where do those boundaries get set? And it turns out that beginning in the 80s, there was this new set of thinking about how to think about organizations and institutions in the theory of the firm. I was teaching this stuff. Again, it's part of industrial organization. A class that began almost exclusively as an industrial organization class and slowly morphed into a political institutions class, which I still teach to this day, although I would imagine the overlap of the readings from now and 1981 were pretty small. And this is where I got a series of early applications. So the paper with Doug North is an example. The bureaucracy work was this, legislatures, all of which in some way use this kind of logic about credible commitments and political institutions and organizations as means of solving cooperation problems. People have an interest in cooperating, but there's an impediment for them to either make this exchange or to make the exchange as they promise, because ex post there's some problem. I'm sure many of you or most of you are familiar with that logic. And I began studying this approach to a whole bunch of other areas: constitutions, democracy, federalism. I have a big project which I've never finished on the Civil War. Doug North told me in 1981, when I declined to publish the first part of it, or publish what I had, he told me I was going to die before I finished that, and I just laughed. But here we are in 2014, and so far the evidence looks like it's on his side. What there is of my manuscript is available on my website. All right. So in 1986, I moved to Stanford, first for 10 weeks, then as a visitor for the year 86 to 87, and then as a full-time member of the, I won't say faculty. I began at Hoover Institution as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the department, which I'll get to in a minute, was immense enmeshed in this deep set of fights, which was personal and ideological. And I was on one. I obviously was on one side. I wasn't in the department, and they voted no on me twice. It took a third time for them to vote yes to actually admit me to their great hallowed hall, so to speak. But one of the things that occurred in the 80s, through no fault of my own, is that the nature of the work I was doing moved from being at the extremes of political science to being mainstream. Part of this had to do with Harvard and Yale, which when they first began to search for replacements for the early post-World War II generation that began retiring, expected that it would then be people in their 50s who came to the top of the lists and that they should go after. And a remarkable thing happened. The consensus among the letter writers was that there was this group of 4 young people in their 30s who were at the top of political science, and that they, Harvard and Yale, ought to hire them. And the people were Fairjohn Fiorina, Ken Shepsley, and Bob Axelrod. Harvard tried to get all of them, some several times, and 2 of them actually went. Yale tried to get several of them, but one at a time, and so none of them ended up there. But I was a beneficiary rather of that move, because all of a sudden I became mainstream political science. I should say also, part of the reason. What am I trying to say? One of the things that occurred is that the salaries for people doing positive theory had caught up with those of the economists. When I went out on the market, there was about a 40% difference in pay. Probably it's larger now for assistant professors, but at the time it was 40%. And by the mid '80s, that had there were too few positive theory people to go around, and so there was a high demand, low supply, and so the prices went up. So that was part of the change. So at this time at Stanford, I just found it a rich environment. I learned a lot. I found it's a great gregarious place. There are a lot of different people to talk to in the law school, in history, anthropology, political science, economics, of course. And it's very interdisciplinary. It has been for years, going back, I think, to the 1950s with Ken Arrow, who set the tone for a lot of it, including the relatively low ego. There's sort of social norms against being prima donnas at Stanford in comparison to some other schools. So one of the fun collaborations is the Weingast collaboration. You can see I have a picture of the 3 of us there from a number of years ago, where we're all wearing our T-shirts. My father had those made. I still have them. I seem to be the only one that wears them. I like to go to conferences with the lawyers, and while they're in their 3-piece suits, I'm in my Weingast T-shirt. So the 3 of us, the way this got organized was the people studying administrative law in law schools began to realize, as procedures got more and more complex and different across legislation, so that legislation would be 1,000 pages long and 980 pages of it would be procedures. They began to realize this can't be all about procedural due process and normative issues, even though most of them made their living by rationalizing why, in this particular case, you would do this unbelievably Byzantine thing. And so Susan Rose Ackerman, who was then at Columbia for 3 years, had a series of conferences where she brought together legal scholars, political scientists, economists who did regulation, and judges. And they turned out to be remarkably productive, and so our first 2 papers came out of this enterprise. And it turned out that we were just had the right comparative advantage to be able to say something systematic about this at the time, about how to think about the politics of administrative procedures. The idea being that procedures manipulate outcomes, and that the way in which outcomes were manipulated by Congress was typically by not by stating what a substance something of substance by stating who did what in what order, who had the right to take somebody to court or not. This turned out to have remarkable purchase. And around about, so our first paper is 1987, the second is 89, and around 1989, some of the lawyers started calling us McNollgast. We attribute this to Jerry Mishaw, who's one of our chief critics, actually, and one of the premier administrative law types at Yale University. And I think it was something of a criticism. I'm searching for a word here. Something derogatory. I don't know. Meant to be insulting, perhaps. But we adopted it. I should say other people did too. Bill Eskridge, who's also at Yale now, was at Georgetown at the time, started referring to McNollgast as a Borg-like entity at the time. And so we appropriated the name. So our first two papers are under our names, and then the next, I don't know, 10 or 12 are under McNollgast. We did have some interesting battles. You know that the law reviews are edited by the second-year students. And so in one of the law reviews where we referred to ourselves as we, the second-year law student changed everything from we back to an I. Only later did she find out there were three of us, and she got so mad. This was in the era just before word processors were coming in of a type where you could actually do the edits on a screen, and they were actually handwritten, so it actually took a lot more time to do. And so she had to undo a bunch of these, and she was very unhappy with this, and she said that, well, we couldn't publish our paper under McNollgast. So we said we wouldn't publish our paper then, and the faculty, since it was a conference volume where there was a faculty editor as well, they suggested, the faculty editor suggested that she might overlook this time. So it did get published. Another thing in this time, so I list a few of the projects that I worked on. Another thing at this time, of course, was the Analytic Narrative Project, which began when Margaret and I and the other three characters were at the center together and found we had some things in common. And that we were all studying these, as Victor said, and many of you know, these events that seem to be unique events, one-time only events. And how do you get purchase on that? You could have a model of that, but how do you know the model's not so highly tailored to that particular case? And so we spent a long time, several years in fact, debating just how you went about thinking about that. And the analytic narratives volume being the result of that. So, also at Stanford, one of the transitions that occurred, without so much foresight on my part really, was the transition from being mostly in American politics to studying political science more broadly. And part of this obviously reflects the idea that I think now is pretty common, the idea that the old definition of the fields are pretty archaic, that they come from another era, that they're not really relevant from the way in which we think about politics now. And yet they still survive for a variety of reasons, one of which is we raise money in the areas for that, and that makes a big difference. And the other being is, well, how will you sell your students? All right, that's something of a coordination game, and even if everybody agrees that the old definitions of the fields are irrelevant, how do you sell your students if you don't call them something? Right? I mean, how do we know that you're an expert in something and can do well? Well, we continue to have these searches by field. So I guess in this period I began studying comparative politics. I began realizing I was working on it without knowing on it. So when I first started my project on the American Civil War, I thought about it in this context of constitutions and commitment kind of idea, that this was about a constitutional problem. There were gains from cooperation between the North and the South, but there were certain kind of tensions, and how was it that they stayed together and what made them fall apart? And one of the things that I observed in 1981, when Bill Riker has an 82 or 83 book on liberalism versus populism, and I read that in draft, and chapter 9 is about slavery. And I had an idea, and his argument was that slavery was the divisive issue at the time, and that there was no political equilibrium, and it was just a matter of time before slavery pulled the two sections apart. Of course, one of the problems with that is that how do you explain the fact that there was 70 years of cooperation? If this really was so, not an equilibrium. And so one of the things I observed while reading that was the idea that, well, there was the Senate. And what happened is the states were admitted in pairs. I've since called it the balance rule. And the advantage of admitting the states in pairs meant that the South had a veto over legislation in the Senate. And that was the principal means by which the country stayed together. And most of the big fights at the time, most of the crises were about this in one way or another. And the real problems tended to come when the existing agreement about splitting the states and the territories ran out. So it's like an incomplete contract. That what do you do when you reach a state of the world that wasn't anticipated? This is a big deal in the economics of contracting, and I think it's a big deal in constitutions. And so that's sort of the essence of that book. And over time, since, as I said, I've been working on this a long time, or maybe more not working on it than working on it, I began to realize that this wasn't a problem in American politics, really. It was a problem in comparative politics, because what this was about the stability of democracy. And that I realized which those of you in comparative probably seems obvious to you now, I realized that not only did we not ask this question, did we not have an answer to why democracy was stable in the United States, that is, in American politics, but we didn't even ask the question. And so it clearly, it just dawned on me sort of all of a sudden that comparative really had a big leg up on us, because at the time there was a lot of interaction between comparative and American, but mostly it was from American into comparative, as people were taking the tools of American politics and studying various things like legislatures in comparative politics. And I realized that this needs to be a two-way street. And so that's how I began to move into the whole issue of democracy. It says newest, there's a list there that says newest and PPT. I'm not sure I want to get too much into that. One of the new things that I've been working on, so we hired a classicist, Josh Ober, who turned out to be really remarkable. He's joined with the classics department, and our classics department is relatively unique in the sense that for years it was a fuddy-duddy small department that tried to imitate the big departments and did it very poorly. I think there were 28 schools that were ranked in classics, and Stanford's ranked 28 of 28 schools. And so in the 90s, this remarkable figure, Ian Morris, who was chair when I was, at the same time I was chair, so I got to know him, had a vision. And the vision was, if we want to do anything besides be number 28, we have to do something that the big places don't do. And that something was social science. And it turns out a lot of the classical questions are classical questions in comparative politics, like why did an oligarchy in ancient Athens start to share power? It was a very modern question. And they realized that the traditional humanities tools that they use didn't really help them with that. And so part of what Josh is moving into our department, being a student of one of the great students of ancient Athens, is precisely to take advantage of modern political science. But he and I have started to work together. We teach a class called High Stakes Politics, for lack of a better term. And the idea is, how do you think about politics in an era when it was much nastier than modern politics? Also in the developing world, you can argue as in the violence trap that it's like that. But in particular, we began reading, as for this class, a lot of the early modern Atlantic community thinkers. So largely starting at Hobbes and then ending with Madison. And what seems remarkable about this, especially since I have no training utterly in political theory, and therefore was in some ways able to read it afresh, is how much these guys were making positive models. That is, they're writing about the world they live in, and their normative structure is not about lessons to our world, as they're read today by modern political theorists, typically, not exclusively. But their real interest was how do they understand why the worlds they're living in were nasty, and how do you make it better? And so we tentatively titled the project "Liberalism is the Answer." That liberalism was their answer to how to solve the problems of their world. So today, the kind of liberalism that Madison and Locke and the like wrote about is largely rejected, except insofar as it has relationship to other kinds of liberalism. But in those days, I think that was part of the steps of political and economic development necessary to develop those societies and make them less nasty. So we call this NPPT, and with the idea, maybe you've heard this label, I'm not sure it's original to us. So if NPT is normative political theory and PPT is positive political theory, then NPPT is normative and positive political theory. So it's the idea of, for example, to give something that for the first time I ever recognized this, not the first work that does this, is Margaret's book on consent, when she talks about understanding about how certain values become entrenched in the society, in part because of political exchanges going on, and in that case having to do with both conscription and the expansion of democracy. So in other words, a positive model about how normative values come to be instantiated and survive and are expressed in a society. How are we doing on time?
You know, I put my
It's
watch
4:15.
away. What time is it?
4:15.
4:15. We're
All right.
good.
Well, I
This is
will
good
just
pace.
say just a little bit more. I was department chair. That took a lot of time. I learned a lot doing it. I applied spatial models to the problems of the department. I explained to some of my co-conspirators what the problems were in these spatial times. That is, remember, I was new in the department. People that had been there a long time were sucked into the emotion of the fights. And one of the advantages of not being invited in the 80s when I moved to Stanford is that I wasn't part of the fights and wasn't a partisan. And so I thought of the department as a simple spatial model. There was a pivotal group, and it turned out to work pretty substantially. And I remember talking to John Fairjohn, this figure right here, explaining to him, and he, in a most patronizing way, said, "Little boy, you will learn." I have to say, he did tell me that he was wrong. John was an amazing person. Let me just say one word about John. John is just, for those of you that have ever met him, he's just an unbelievable mind. He's close to a man of all trades, a genius, anybody that I've ever met. He's just so fast, knows everything, and he's got a temperament that's just really terrific. He wants to know what you're doing all the time. How can and part of his own persona is being one of the most helpful people that you'll ever meet. And so if you get an hour with him, you'll learn, it'll transform whatever you're working on. And I learned a lot from him, both as he was the most important person in social science at Stanford in the 1980s. He brought all the political economy people there after Barron, and he figured out how to do that. And one of the things, and he would talk a lot about it, and I didn't think I was absorbing much of that, but when I became chair, I remembered what he did, and then I said, oh, that's why you do that. For example, this is going to come later. One of the last things is the Caltech rules. So I have Caltech rules for chairs. So one of the things that as a chair you want to do is, there are often these pots of money in different parts of the university. And what happens is everybody that doesn't have money, that wants money, comes to them and says, you should give me your money. And of course, there are way too many people to fund than there is money. And so as a consequence, how do you go about getting their money? Well, it turns out you need an idea that is going to work for them. That is, think about it as gains from exchange. And part of what really just amazed me how well it worked was, I want to do something and it's in your interest too, and here's why. And it turns out that really worked. And I remember saying to Fairchild afterwards, I watched you do this, and I did a bunch of this, and it really works. And to this day, I'm not sure why. I looked at him like, sort of questioning, and he said, I didn't know why it worked either. It just did. Oops, wrong button. North Wallace and Weingast. Well, we're getting to, I want to stop talking. So, North Wallace and Weingast. So we have this book, John and Doug and I. On the one hand, I'm very happy with the framework, but I'm also deeply dissatisfied with it. John and I had real big differences about this book, and I think the book is less than what it could be because of those disagreements. And part of the movement to the violence trap is really to deal with some that is working with Cox and North instead of Wallace and North. I think is a way of dealing with what I think is missing, and so I sort of feel that the book is deeply dissatisfying because it gives a picture of what the development problem is. Non-developed states look like this, natural states. Developed states look like this. States that move from one to the other go through this process, what we call the doorstep conditions. But there's no sense about why are natural states stable, why are they in equilibrium, why are open access states in equilibrium, and what in the world allows some states to make the transition and others not. So that's what Gary, Doug, and I are working on, and I think we've made some progress on that. I have an obsession with Adam Smith. I don't think I'll say too much about that right now. Here's a picture of Adam Smith in Edinburgh. It's a nice statue. I was there. I wish I'd taken a better picture than I had of it, and then I used that. I find Smith really remarkable. He's known as the father of economics. I don't think he was an economist in the following sense. As my father would say, he didn't know from economists. There was no such thing as an economist, and that's a modern construction. Right, the division of disciplines is something as a 20th century phenomenon, maybe late 19th century in some places. It was all human behavior to him, and he wrote about all of it. He wrote about language and psychology and morality and politics and economics and history, and it all fit. It was all one approach, and the only way you can think of him as an economist, as most economists do, is by picking out the economics and skipping the rest. And if you look at the historians of economic thought, they do all that, pick out the economics. They almost all talk about how his historical stuff is just a big diversion. I don't think so. But I'm not going to say much more about that. Let me end on a note, Caltech rules. So one of the remarkable things about Caltech was having this new faculty. It was a new program, as I said. So all the people that went there were relatively young. I think the most senior person was, there was one person, Jim Quirk, an economist, who was in his 50s. Charlie Plott was in his 40s, and everybody else was in their 20s and 30s. And so in a way, they were all struggling to learn the professionalization process too. There were very few of us graduate students. They needed to compete for us for RAs. And so we ended up sitting around the mailbox for an hour, everybody. And there was talk about writing papers and about referee reports. How do you read a referee report? So an assistant professor would get a note that, God, this is terrible. Look what this said. And then one of the senior people would say, here, let me see that. It says, and he says, this isn't terrible. This is just hedging their bets. What it's saying is, if you do this, we will take your paper. But there's all this criticism, right? And so you need to learn how to divide the criticism and see what the message is. And so there were just tons of so the point is that the faculty were just unbelievably articulate about professionalization. How do you design a paper? That kind of thing. And so the first piece in the series that I wrote was Caltech Rules for Writing. It's on my website, as I say. You can get it if you want. It's short. The version now is 4 pages. I'm working on a longer version that's 6. Let me say one thing about that. I think the most important thing about writing a paper is understanding your audience. And understanding that the way in which you read papers in graduate school, the best papers, the one you want to admire, the one you admire the most, and the ones you like to emulate the most, is not how the reader of your paper is going to read. Right? The referee is somebody who's going to take a few minutes. Every referee resents being a referee. You're not really paid for it. If you're paid a nominal amount of money. Certainly not worth your time to do it. You do it for professional reasons. And moreover, you don't need the best reasons why this paper should be rejected. By the way, most papers are rejected. In my experience, I reject 9 out of 10, maybe more. I've talked to other people. That's generally what people say. And so the point is you don't need to know the best reasons why this paper is bad. You're immediately reading it with a suspicion that it is bad, right? Most are. And all you need is a set of sufficient conditions. This paper's bad because. So if that's the kind of reader, that's the strategic problem you need to solve. You need to think about that kind of reader while you're writing. And that means your paper has to be focused. And how do you focus it? Well, that's part of what the rules are about. But the whole rules are designed to think that if this is the kind of reader, what kind of design of a paper makes it more likely that a cursory reader, somebody reading very quickly, will at least understand what you're doing. And of course, many readers never read more than the introduction, which means that if you don't state your point clearly in the introduction, they're not going to get it because they're not reading beyond that. And so all introductions have to have 4 parts, I say, and that's part of Caltech rules. So the 4 parts very simply are, 1, you got to state a question. So the first 3 parts are basically, what's the excuse for a paper on this topic? Why should I read your paper? I got too many, right? The whole idea is people have too much to read. You do now. Well, it's going to get only worse as you have to teach more and spend time on committees. And so the key thing is going to be, you need to solve this problem. And so the first 3 points are, what's the excuse for another paper? So first, what's the question? Second, why is there a need for another paper on this? And the answer is always one of 3 or 4 things, right? There's a controversy in the literature, a contradiction, 2 competitive findings, or here's maybe there's a consensus and here's a novel idea. One of those kind of things. The third part is really the promise. You need to tell people that if they spend an hour with your paper, that they won't be wasting their time. So you need to summarize what your answer is. And so that's more than 3 sentences, but less than 4 paragraphs, right? So you need a very cogent way of saying what you're doing because people need to see that if they actually spend time with your paper instead of the next one, that they'll get something out of it. So let me end there.
I guess we will open up the questions. I'm sure there's several, and you can give me advice on being an assistant professor later, but Caltech rules for job interviews, I'm sure we might have questions about, or writing and research ideas. What has motivated or stimulated ideas beyond maybe some of the stuff we saw here?
I'd actually like to find out if you've written anything on what you think about Adam Smith. I'd be really curious to find if you've written anything, or if there's anything online, or how we can find out more what your take on Adam Smith is.
Well, I'm in the beginnings of this. I've been working on it for a year and a half, and I've written 400 or 500 pages. I write all the time. I think if you want to write, you need to write every day, and you need to write, learn to where it's not a chore to write. And in particular, it makes it easier to write in advance so that you're not writing up against a deadline. But it's not in a real condition to circulate. I can tell you about some of the ideas I have. So one of the big issues is Adam Smith's work unified, and are there general principles? And I have, I guess the most complete of the notes that I have is on this. And I think Adam Smith has this remarkable methodological unity whereby everything he writes about is in an equilibrium comparative statics form. So stuff about religion, that is the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, feudalism, obviously the economics. His essay on language is this form. And so there's a real methodological unity that nobody's noticed before from this. And as part of that, I translate a bunch of the arguments that he does make across a wide variety of fields into this. But I've sketched what might be a book, but like my Civil War book, I'm not going to promise to complete all
that. I'd be interested to hear where you think the field is going in terms of questions or a set of theoretical concerns that we haven't yet grappled with that you see us sort of moving towards, and also in terms of sort of methodology. Where do you think we'll be in 5 or 10 years? Doing the same stuff or new stuff? Or?
Well, I don't know I'm the best person to answer these things. I think that there's methodologically, there certainly seems to be a big. It just the emphasis on methods just grows. There seems to be a move away from theoretical methods into empirical methods, and the number of empirical methods. The range of empirical methods is obviously exploding. The big data and GIS and all that. So I think that's going to continue for a while. I think we will see a renaissance in theory at some point because so many of the ideas that people are testing are come from abstract models from a generation earlier. And so if that's where hypotheses are generated, we'll see much more of that. I think at some point. But that might go for a while. One other thing on that, I think, I don't know if it's just because I've started to take more of an interest in political theory than before, but I noticed that there are a lot more people interested in this connection between positive and normative. So.
So, related, this may be jumping ahead because you're going to speak to the paper on the violence trap. You pretty much argue against Collier's assessment that there's these 4 distinct traps. Did you get a lot of pushback from Collier and his team as this? I'm not sure to what extent this paper has circulated to these.
Yeah, I'm not sure I didn't send it to him, so I don't know if he's seen it. I certainly haven't heard back. I would expect.
I'd be curious to see because it was a pretty
Mm-hmm.
confident assessment with all their econometrics and deriving it. I mean, it was a very clean theoretical framework, and they're mostly letting the data speak in their assessment. So yeah, I'm sure that'll come out soon enough.
Good. I like controversy.
Yeah.
Controversy's been good to me.
It seems like both the success stories and the failed ones sort of start with there wasn't a lot of space or what I was doing wasn't accepted, and that we've heard a lot of people who succeeded sort of like persevering in that path. But I'm sure that there are a lot of people we never get to hear from who failed horribly by persevering in that path. So my question is, what about like once you got sort of the negative feedback of there might not be a space for you in this department, what in that context allowed you to believe that persevering would actually would allow you to continue to be sort of a successful academic? Like, what was it in that context that allowed you to persevere that we might take as cues if we're ever in a situation like that?
Well, the way I thought about it, in part, was, and perhaps wholly naively, I was, certainly much less than half my current age, was, Caltech was a very special place, and it was about this, but it wasn't unique in the sense that it wasn't the only. There was Rochester and Carnegie Mellon was going, and there were other places, and then there was a wide variety of economists scattered, that were working on this, and I just thought it would grow, and maybe very naively so. And it's also what I wanted to work on, and my own work was progressing, and I started to get that published, and then Ken and I ended up having this incredibly productive relationship in the early years, and I think we wrote 12 papers in 5 years or something. So, and I guess the feedback was fairly quick, in the sense that so this conference that I mentioned. Where my paper was in a sense a failure, was in May of 1980, and by 81 I had a draft of the Federal Trade Commission paper, and so that began to be successful, and I must have given that 15 times, and that got really great feedback, and so people really I think reacted positively to that, and so. As a matter of thinking about it, not as I'm going to spend my whole career doing this no matter what. So, certainly, the idea of spending a couple more years seeing if I can do better. I got feedback, and this guy George Stigler, who won a Nobel Prize in the '80s, started liking my stuff and started publishing in the JPE. I have, I don't know, four papers in the 80s maybe, or maybe something like that. And the attitude at WashU, I didn't think, this is an aside about the story, we don't know if you belong here. So I sort of thought that, well, these are, this is a second-rate place, it's not a first-rate place. These guys don't have the vision of what the future is. I was naive enough to think I did. I now realize that it was much more risky than I thought, but that's what youth are about, right? But one of the upside of the second-rateness of the place was when George started liking my work, the economists in my department started saying, well, they're still not sure if it's economics, but if George likes it, it must be okay. So, by my third or fourth year, things were turned around quite quickly, I think. Quite quickly in retrospect, not without a lot of hard work to make it work. As they say, we learn from failure. And not everybody can. And I think that one of the things about this business is everybody gets knocks, gets these horrible, humiliating things, and often it's in public. My presentation in this conference at May of 1986 was before all the greats of all the people I wanted to impress in economics, and I didn't. Right? And so, okay, it doesn't feel good, but you spend time, okay, well, what did I do wrong? How do I make sure that doesn't happen again? And I think that's a really important attitude.
One of the themes of your intellectual journey seems to be interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm curious if you have any advice on how we might do that as grad students now. How do we achieve that cross-talk with other departments in this day and age?
Well, personally, that's not a problem I faced in the sense that Caltech was much more interdisciplinary just by design, and so we weren't in programs like this. And moreover, we weren't in programs where there were fields, like, where cohorts are separated by fields. So I haven't thought about the problem of graduate students. I think a lot of it depends upon the nature of the faculty connections, because the graduate students are so close to the faculty, whether or not they actually. So that kind of direct collaboration, I think, will take an effort. I think one of the interesting things would be, whether or not you think other work in other fields is of use to yours, for your work, and whether or not you start reading it and feel that you have the confidence to learn some of it or not. So I think that's a useful place to start.
Maybe poorly formulated question, but I'll give it my best. I was just at a workshop where there was a lot of talk about elitism in various ways, because as the techniques of political science have gotten much more complicated and involved, and there's been a lot, in particular comparative politics, there's been a lot more emphasis on really complicated interventions and field work. This requires a lot of financial capacity in ways that maybe most of your work hasn't, but then also creates an interesting dividing line between kind of departments that potentially can fund a lot of that and departments that can't fund a lot of that. Just wondering what you think about that more broadly. If you think that are ways to counter that, or you're satisfied with the way it is, or you think something should be changed about it, I guess.
I'm not sure I've been so cognizant of this, in part because I work less with students since being chair. Before I was chair, I was involved with 40% of the people in our department, and since much less so. And so, and I'm certainly not. I don't teach in the main core and comparative, and so this is not something I see directly. So I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer, but I will go ask, because it would be troublesome in part because it's going to mean there's a lot less competition of ideas, and I think you always want ideas to be able to come in from the outside, and to the extent that there are financial barriers to entry, that doesn't bode well.
I have a question for you, Barry. Reading The Violence Trap carefully in your book from 2009, on a similar topic. Do you think within our lifetime we could see underdevelopment and poverty be a concern of the past? I know that you're pretty bearish in terms of some of the policy prescriptions and stuff that flow out of the violence trap, because the problem of violence will never go away. In a sense, I feel like that's a constant throughout both the first approach and the paper that you shared with us. What are your views? I think of someone like Jeff Sachs. He says, open the spigots. It's about getting the money to the right people in the right places. Or even, I mean, maybe we short-shrifted the fact that knowledge of development is still not as accessible in the way I framed the key puzzle that motivates your work these days, which is if we know so much about what causes development, why is underdevelopment still such a big problem? So what are some views on that? And I guess for students and professors and academics, is there anything we could do short of publishing, going to conferences, talking people's ear off that we think have any levers of power or influence?
I've been a pessimist on this, political equilibrium. It's kind of like, if we know so much about it, why can't we change it? I mean, think about the same question in physics. We know so much about how gravity works. Why can't we change it? It's not that way, And it's not that I think that the laws we have of political science in any way emulate those for their clarity and unbelievable nature of predictions. And yet, I think that there's still these equilibrium forces, and it's really hard to go against them. Now, the question is, so as you suggested, one of the things I believe is that a lot of the standard advice doesn't work. That poor countries are not like rich countries, except they have less of everything. In fact, they're organized very differently, and therefore trying to pull a piece or a chunk of something from the developed world, like elections, and sticking in the developing world, it's not going to work the same way. And so I think, and so that leads me to be very pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic about the nature of the way in which people think about the problem now. But it could be that, if you start thinking about the problem in the right way, things will look different. I don't see that. But then, I don't see all the normative implications of this and how you start to make a difference. So.
A quick follow-up would be, though, you mentioned Margaret's book on patriotism. Is this the 1997 one? Yeah, right? The fact that normative theory and positive theory, there's overlap between them in that part of Margaret's theory is that you can actually find a way to disseminate and inculcate certain norms that then become self-fulfilling prophecies or allow for coordination or cooperation. And you also talk about liberalism as being the solution to nasty politics. So is there anything on that front, disseminating ideas or political culture?
Well, on the first, I'm not sure that I'm not sure I would characterize it that way. I think it's one thing to say in the settings where there was a demand for this, in Western Europe, where everybody's nervous, especially with Germany growing in power. There's a reason for them to go through this exercise. That is for people to make choices that are different than the natural state choices because they've got a problem. So the key to the natural state that I'm thinking about is the nature of the internal violence, multiple sources of violence, and that the state's organized in ways that restrict this internal violence. And the answer we suggest is the nature of that there's rent creation, not rent. It's not rent seeking. It's that the state actually creates rents as a means as a productive in a productive way. That is, what they're doing is they're creating cooperation by buying off the people who have the power to fight for what they want. And so you have to, in order to get peace in that world, you got to make people better off playing the game rather than fighting. And so that means you get very asymmetric societies. You can't have the rule of law because these are very personal things. People that are more powerful get more. They have more privileges, and so privileges are very anti-rule of law. And so why would those people give that up, especially if there's this violence for it? Well, it could be that there's another source of violence that's worse. So I think about France, for example. So France had between 1789 at the Revolution and 1870, something like 10 or 12 constitutions. Very unstable place. There are two big factions once you get past the Napoleonic era that are fighting each other. Each are trying to vanquish each other, and they're fighting. And when one gets power, they try and persecute the other. No legitimate opposition in this in this world. And what happens? What finally changes this is what I call the first invasion of Germany by Germany. Not literally an invasion. The other two, World War I and World War II, were literal invasions. But you know, France gets really beaten up pretty badly in this war. They don't expect to. Nobody expects them to. And not only that, at the same time, Germany unites. And they have universal male conscription. And it's this immense thing. How do we ever survive that? Well, the only hope is to give up these other things. And so people are willing to give up, in the system, give up their privileges and their right to fight. If I fight you, that means we're vulnerable. And so instead of getting more, we get less. And so I think that kind of thing is a very special thing. And if that is true, then it's a very pessimistic way of looking at the problem.
Barry, in your story,
Mhm.
often when you tell that story in a variety of different settings, it's more than just that there's been a change. There's a change in the objective factors in the situation. There's also a belief change about what's going on and what you can do. And they're actors in that process.
Mhm.
And you might talk a little bit about that. I mean, that seems to be a very important part of where your work began to move after the initial Civil War stuff.
Yeah.
Was really thinking about those kinds of actors and how it sounds very Ricarian in their aesthetics.
Right. Yes, the very 1980s. Very much so. So I think leaders make a difference in the way, in complex coordination problems. So I think one of the fundamental coordination problems of constitutions and democracy has to do with what do we think are the legitimate rules. And when people disagree about what the rules ought to be, then they're in difficult places. So for example, if people can, begin with the premise that if people coordinate against the regime falls. So we're sort of seeing that in Ukraine, we saw that in the Arab Spring, lots of examples of this. And so one thing, obviously, dictators spend a lot of time trying to prevent that. But another thing is when people disagree about that, it's very hard to coordinate against the regime. And so I think all places that end up having stable constitutions have moments where there are ideas that get articulated and values. And a lot of this has to do with the defining of the solution to this coordination base so that we're all on the same page, so that we can all see the same bright lines about whether or not the government has transgressed the rules or not. And some places are much better at that historically than others, and some places have the circumstances where they're being propelled. I think nothing about this problem of an outside Germany compels the right answer. That is, compels a state to actually create a liberal constitution. You know, I mean, one of the things Tilly points out in his work is one might think of I don't know, several hundred or 1,000 states around the year 1000 in Europe, and now there are 25 or something. States get absorbed; they disappear.
I'll also ask a follow-up question. I'm a regular listener on Econ Talk, where I heard you talk a little while ago, and there's been a whole range of talks there about the hubris of development interventions. There's a really good one about a woman who followed around Jeffrey Sachs for the last 7 years, which is pretty fascinating. But the question is then, so given what you're just, given your position, what's your position on, political economy, economic, political development interventions that are kind of come from an academic perspective or informed by that? What's your take?
Well, I have one thing to say about it. I'm not sure I have deep opinions, but I think one of the problems with interventions that academics create is that they're experimental and they're small. And when they're small, they don't have a lot of resources. And I think so. It's very hard to see what happens when you scale up. Because when you scale up, then other parties start to get interested in this in a way that they're not interested in the experiment. And indeed, they may have an interest in collaborating with the experiment to the extent that if it works, money will flow. So you've seen this thing about malaria, as I understand it, malaria, and so this is something Ken Arrow worked on. Malaria can be eradicated at approximately a penny a day per person. It's an incredibly trivial amount of money. And so why don't we just give them the money in the form of pills? Here they are. Well, the problem is that they get to these countries and they get into the black market and they get siphoned away from where they're going. And only a small amount that's actually that's only a small amount that's delivered actually goes into the program. It all gets siphoned off into the markets, and you can go to the markets in various places in Africa and see the boxes that say "Do not sell" for sale. So.
Kind of similar to that, a moment ago, Victor said, what can we do as academics aside from going to conferences and publishing papers? And do you think that academics could possibly or should play any sort of a role in the public sphere or as in advocacy? Is that reasonable, or is it normatively a good or bad thing?
I think as part of the policy debate, I think that's a good thing. I think good ideas come from a variety of places, and economics has generated quite a bit over the years. I mean, just the whole discourse over the course of my life about regulation, was changed. It's much more economic-y in the sense that people worry much more about costs and how do you do things efficiently and what are the politics. Like the whole idea of clean coal, dirty air. The idea that there are politics that systematically cause compromises that that if we're all aware about this, they're less likely to happen. So in that sense, I'm in favor of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not terrifically familiar with your work on the Third Republic.
I haven't written anything on that. I just studied it.
So the question I have is, from your framework, where one possibility, I guess, would be that the crushing of the commune is largely froth on the overall politics, and the other, which I think would have been a more common view in France for a long time, was that was really crucial for the emergence of this new Third Republic, which is stable for a very long time. I'm just curious.
Yeah, the Third Republic, I think, is really important for that reason. In fact, I should have said that to this day, the Third Republic is the longest lived constitution in France since the Revolution, and soon to be overtaken by the Fifth. But only ended with the invasion of the Nazis. I really think I neglect that in telling a very simple tale. This has always been one of my, in a sense, weaknesses, the reductionist nature of telling stories to make a point. And I think that the commune is, clearly meaningful, and it had a lot to do with the disorder in society, and I think the nature of elites thinking, we're not necessarily in charge here. And that there was another reason for cooperating as well. So I do think that as part of what occurs, and of course the path-dependent nature about which any country would go through this in responding to a similar thing. So Korea has this has a similar presence, although no one big event. South Korea versus North Korea, and so these details differ, but I don't think that they're fully the essence of the idea.
Well, the only reason I ask that is, one argument about Western Europe would be, I suppose, that the marginalization, certainly of the communist parties and to some degree of the socialist parties, was crucial for the creation of a modern liberal democracies in the region. And since what I do is the Middle East, one argument that many people would make there would be that the crushing and marginalization of the Muslim Brothers today, or similar movements, is equally crucial for the emergence of liberal democracy. And I just wondered what your thoughts might be.
Well, I wonder if that's if it's crucial in the sense of a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. I'm not sure I would make a prediction that if crushed, then liberalism.
But without crushing, no liberalism.
Yeah.
I don't see that, because I don't see how you could have the communists coming to political power in 1946 and then have a liberal
Oh, I agree, and I think that one of the things that we see in say, post-Franco Spain as well as post-Pinochet Chile is sort of the moderation of the left in that regard, and in part in exchange for being able to rule, which I think is a big factor in both those countries. And I think that, sort of the key moments of the early post-war era were really important in that regard. And things could have gone very differently, I think.
I actually have one final question, but are there any others? Because I don't want to keep speaking if some folks have questions. No?
Actually,
go ahead.
if
Yeah.
I can interrupt. So for the graduate students in the room, what would you say are the most important components of your graduate training that have influenced your career trajectory and your scholarship?
I would say interdisciplinariness, and that the faith that that we could read another literature and learn it. My first year in graduate school, I was reading the bureaucracy literature as an RA to Roger Noel, and I thought that was very helpful. So that's one. Another was tools. So I'm less mathematical every year. As I go out for the last 20 years. But at the time when I came out, I was on the frontiers of positive theory, so I was very, so tools were a very important thing, and I think that was really critical to the first decade or two of work that I did. So those are two things. And another thing is, I think, so think about problems in political science as problems in political science rather than, oh, that's in another field, I don't have any expertise on that, because I think these days we all bring something from one field into another, and that, there's so much cross-fertilization going on. More broadly, thinking about, the fields as this archaic structure that persists for reasons, for various reasons, I think that this is I really think of this problem as a very general problem and why ideas live beyond their usefulness, in a sense. That is the field structures. It's living beyond its usefulness. It's in the way of more steady progress, I think, about political science, which is much more about common kind of problems and generating insights that come from one field and using them in another. And we see tons of that, and I urge people to think even more in those terms.
I think that's a great way to end. Thanks a lot. That was very insightful and valuable. I'll ask my question later. So hanging out with Jeff Sachs for 7 years, huh?
Yeah, you should
The
listen to
things
this
that she's
podcast.
seen.
Oh my God, we went and lived in all the villages part time.
Does she have an axe to grind, or is